Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know, from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars, topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Basketball Podcast, right here in the GSMC Podcast Network. It is your host, back again with another show for you guys today, Brice Lewis, here to talk about everything basketball related in both college and professional. And we have another good show for you today. We're going to get into some more Houston rumors. Obviously, you know, big deals happened, the big trade happened from John Wall and Russell Westbrook. We're having more information, more news, more rumors coming out of Houston about, you know, who they were blaming for their playoff struggles, why this trade was made, and John Wall's confidence in James Harden being a part of the team this year. I'm also going to start, since the season is about 2 weeks away, I believe about 2.5 weeks away, we're going to get into some of my reviews. I'm going to review teams in the Eastern Conference on this episode and next, and then the next episode I'm going to and then after the next episode, the next two episodes after that, I'm going to get into the Western Conference. I'm going to review every team in their offseason and what their outlook, in my opinion, on them going into the season is going to be. Plus, we're going to get into really a segment we haven't done in a while, some college basketball news. Obviously, games have gone by. We have some things have happened. You know, I'm going to give my impressions, maybe give you all the top 25 teams right now in the country, top 10 clearly, and go from there. So that's what we're going to do in today's podcast. Before I get into it, don't forget to follow us on GSMC_basketball on Twitter. If you want to follow us there, interact with us about everything that happens in the world of basketball. We love to appreciate you. You know, love to talk to you guys out there. Also, don't forget, whatever platform you're listening to us on, don't forget to subscribe or leave a review. We definitely appreciate it. Definitely appreciate the support that you give the podcast. I definitely appreciate the support that you give the podcast and going on and moving forward. But like I said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, you know, obviously we know Houston had, you know, the playoff struggles and everything happened, you know, losing in 5 games to Lakers. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, obviously in those situations look for someone to blame. So apparently, according to a report, one of the reasons why the Rockets were so, out of the two, they were so willing and so ready to move on from Westbrook is that he was kind of looked at as a scapegoat. Because they looked at what happened in the playoffs and said he had a poor performance, and so he's not going to be able to get the job done here, and we need to get rid of him. And, you know, so that is one of the reasons why people feel like, again, they were more active in trying to move off of Westbrook. And the only thing I have to say about that is that I think that's unfair to Russell Westbrook. I think James Harden deserves someone to blame. James Harden did not play well in those last 2 games. Listen, the Lakers had a great game plan. They knew how to defend the Rockets. They double-team Harden, left Westbrook open. It was a great game plan. But at the same time, Westbrook, you know, to me, he was Westbrook. You knew he couldn't shoot when you traded for him. That's why people were wondering why did you trade for Westbrook? I mean, remember, the news came out. Daryl Morey didn't even want Westbrook. It was the owner who wanted to bring Westbrook to Houston. And if the owner says he wants it, you have to get it. Because Daryl Morey knew, I'm trying to shoot, Westbrook couldn't shoot. That goes against what I'm trying to do here. And so, to me, what I saw from Westbrook was just typical Westbrook. I mean, they left him open. He couldn't make the shot. I mean, it's not like he was capable of doing it, because we've seen it for a long time, and he just flat out just completely fell on his face. It's not like Paul George, who what we saw from Paul George in the playoffs, we've seen better versions of Paul George. So we know Paul George is capable of being better, but you saw the worst version of Paul George. And so to me, I don't look at what happened with the playoffs with Russell and say, well, clearly he could have played better, but he just fell flat on his face. He underachieved, he choked, and that's why he deserves to get the blame. It's not like that. See, James Harden, even his past performances, remember that Game 6 against the San Antonio Spurs in the Western Conference semifinals, I believe. Remember that. He choked. Harden did not play the way he had played all the way up to that point. he completely acted like he was a different player. See, that to me is where you can maybe say, okay, he's the reason why it didn't work. We knew Westbrook couldn't shoot. The Lakers' game plan defensively was double team Harden to get the ball out the hands, cover everyone else, but leave Westbrook open. Because they know Westbrook can't shoot. So to me, Westbrook couldn't shoot before, couldn't shoot then. I don't really see how you can sit there and say, well, you know, he failed, he had a poor performance. That you knew what he was. It's like saying if Shaq was open for threes all the time and he bricked all of them, well, he had a poor performance. Shaq can't shoot threes. I mean, what do you expect? So to me, I think that's unfair to Russell. I think James needs more blame, like I said, because he didn't play well. Like I said, Lakers had a great game plan, but James Harden is the superstar in the heart of that team in terms of basically where James Harden takes them is where they will go, and he did not do well. And, you know, you've noticed a lot, you know, Houston is not, you know, people have said this, I've seen it in comment sections on sports boards and everything. People wonder, why don't we give James Harden more blame than we give any superstar? We always like to sit here and say it was everybody else. They did the same thing with Chris Paul. When they failed in the playoffs, they blamed Chris Paul. Even though Chris Paul would have been the reason they would have made it to the finals if he stayed healthy against Golden State. But they didn't want to put the blame on James. They wanted to put the blame on Chris. Because James may have not been the fondest of their relationship or the basketball on the court relationship. So, okay, let's blame Chris then and get him out of town. And I think that's unfair. I think that's super unfair because, you know, James, like I said, James deserves a lot of that. The rest of the team deserves play. They didn't play well. You know, Mike D'Antoni, we know how he is. He's a guy who's openly said he doesn't make adjustments. He's going to do what he do, and then we're going to see what happens. So to me, I don't think you could sit here and blame him for that. I don't think you could sit here and say Russ was the reason, and etc. And so on and so forth. So, you know, that's the first thing. And then, you know, also there was a report that came out of Houston that John Wall was singled out by the Houston Rockets, that he was a target, basically. The Houston, when Westbrook wanted to trade and they wanted to get rid of Westbrook, they said, okay, Harden wants to trade too, because this is what the report says. That Harden, the reason why they made the trade for John Wall is because they looked at John Wall as not a major downgrade. And with that, they feel like John Wall is a very high quality player who could help smooth things out with Harden, saying, listen, we got the point guard that you prefer to play with. We still got a star point guard, so we can still be competitive, and etc. And so basically, Houston was like, okay, we don't want to downgrade in this position. We don't want to trade Westbrook, and then we don't have a star at point, and then we have like just a guy. Because now it just goes into why James wants to leave. Like, it makes sense. Like, okay, if we just trade for Eric Bledsoe, or if we trade for a Jeff Teague, or if we trade for a Terry Rozier, realistically, from a star potential player, you don't think any of those players are better than Russell Westbrook. And so, and what's James' issue with the organization? He feels like, first, he was not involved in decisions, so he feels a little rubbed the wrong way by that. But also, he doesn't feel like the team, the way it's constructed, is built to compete. And trading Westbrook would not make the team better. It would make them worse, realistically, from a talent perspective. So, basically, they made the move for Wall because they feel like John Wall is a star guy. He's a star player. If he can remain healthy, we feel like we still have a star here. And so, it's like, hey, we got DeMarcus Cousins, who we think could maybe, if he could be 80% of what he used to be, could be an effective player. We got John Wall here, a star guy. We got you. We still got PJ. You know what I'm saying? We still got Eric Gordon. We got Christian Wood, a guy that people think could really break out to be one of the better big men in the league. We have a good roster. We have a young head coach in Steven Salas that we think can really put you in an offense that you'll really like, make the team more efficient, effective, and we could be a really good team this year and still compete in the Western Conference. Because what they're trying to do is continue to sell to Harden. Listen, if you stay here, we could compete. Because right now, Harden does not feel like this team is in a position to compete. And everybody's saying that, you know, you just got to give Harden some time to really, you know, think about some things. And maybe he'll give it a shot. You know, because the big thing here is, and what we're going to figure out when we get close to the season is it to the point where Harden won't show up and play games. Will he be willing to miss games because he's just not trying to stay? That's kind of the key here. That's the big key here. Because, listen, yes, training camp has basically probably started for the Houston Rockets, and he's not there. But listen, if he wants to miss training camp, okay. But if the games come around and he starts to miss those games, it'll show you how serious Harden is about not playing and wanting to be traded. And I think what the Houston Rockets are hoping is that if they could get in contact with James, stay in contact with James, they may be able to convince him. You never know. Those preseason games could be huge for Houston. They may sit here and say, we kind of got to make an impression right now. Maybe even the regular season. Maybe, because realistically, you would think as a person, if Harden sits out, he would still probably watch the games. He would still watch Houston because, why wouldn't he? You know what I'm saying? Why wouldn't he watch? And what if Houston wins games without him? And they look good. The players look good. And Wall looks good. And Cousins looks good. And PJ still looks good. Christian Wood looks good. And then the offense they're running looks good. And they're playing good defense. Maybe that way they can maybe say, hey, James, see, if we add a player of your caliber to us, we think we could be that good and compete for a championship in the Western Conference. That's something that could happen. Because like I said, we don't know if James is even going to show up to start the season. So we're going to have to see, what happens with that situation. We're going to have to see if James decides to show up. Now, one guy on Houston that does think he's going to show up is the guy they just traded for, John Wall. John Wall came out and said, I think he'll be here. And the funny thing that happened was then James Harden, I believe, an hour or two after those quotes were posted on his Instagram story with the emoji that kind of shows your teeth, kind of like ooh, like almost just like ha ha ha. that I'm just saying that's kind of what the emoji said to me. He was just like all right, I appreciate your confidence, but I don't know about that one, John. So it sounds like with James Harden making a statement on his IG like that, it kind of makes it seem like I don't think I'll be there. So if that's where he still stands at this second, like I said, Houston's going to have to make some decisions into the future about what they want to do with him, what the direction is, because they still have to coach like, they're going to try to have a successful season. And the thing I'm intrigued by, too, with the situation is I'm sure John has tried to be in contact with James. I'm sure DeMarcus and PJ and guys have tried to get in contact with James because James is cool with those guys. We don't know how close they are, but we know that they have relationships with those guys. And so it kind of makes you wonder, are they trying to get at Harden to say, hey, man, just give it a shot, man. Please, just like give us a chance. Because they know realistically we won't know how good this team is unless James is here. And so they're trying to get him to okay, give us a chance to show you that we can be that good. That's all we're asking for, James, is the opportunity to show you that we can be that good. We just need the commitment from you that you're going to be here to allow us to display that. And so to me, that's going to be the interesting thing that we're going to have to keep an eye on with Houston, because their biggest story right now is James Harden's going to show up, and we're going to have to stay tuned and see if he's going to actually show up and be a part of the team this year with the season right around the corner in a couple of weeks. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into my Eastern Conference review. We're going to start at the bottom of the Eastern Conference and then work our way up. So we're going to go get into that next segment. Stay tuned.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed a lot of different things that were being discussed and reported out of Houston. Starting with that Russell Westbrook was looked at as a scapegoat for Houston's playoff struggles. They tried to say he was the main reason, because of his poor performance, why they could not have success in the playoffs. Also, we discussed John Wall being confident that Harden's going to be there, even though Harden posted on his Instagram story basically indicating, I'm not so sure about that one. And basically that he was a guy that Houston targeted when Westbrook wanted a trade, because they looked at him as not a major downgrade, and they wanted to think that if we brought him in, it could still present to Harden that they still have a very comparable roster that can still compete. So basically last segment was a Houston segment, discussing everything that's coming out of Houston. So, that was the update there. Now I'm going to start reviewing teams' off seasons and teams in general going into the new season. Starting in the Eastern Conference, we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. This is probably going to take me 2 shows in terms of 2 segments each show to be able to complete the Eastern Conference as a whole, because I really want to give every team the time allotted in terms of just, listen, there may be some teams I have more to say about and some teams I have less to say about, but just know into these 2 shows coming up, I will get them done. And so we're going to go ahead and get into it. And we're going to look into the Cleveland Cavaliers as the first team, as we're starting from the bottom and going to the top. So the Cleveland Cavaliers are the first team on that list. And Cleveland is a team that worst record in the Eastern Conference last year. And so, they had a lot of changes this offseason. Not really too much has changed from a roster perspective this offseason. They've pretty much been the same. Now, they do have J.B. Bickerstaff as the head coach. He's the guy who, is going to stick in that spot. They have a lot of young talent. They have a lot of guys that they've drafted over the years and people look at as good. They still have Kevin Love. We remember the saga of Kevin Love last year, how a lot of people were talking about how he wanted out, how he was looking to leave, Cleveland. He wanted a new, fresh start. And so people were discussing that, where could he go? He was big in trade rumors last year. Never got traded, though. He's still there. No trade rumors this offseason. So it looks like Kevin Love, unless something comes out of the woodworks, we don't know what's going to happen during the next trade deadline, he's going to be there. Like I said, they got Kevin Porter Jr. He's had some legal trouble. We'll have to see how that is. He's a young guy they have a lot of hope for. Andre Drummond, he opted in this offseason. He's here. He a guy who is the traditional center, not the spread center, but a traditional guy. Colin Sexton, a guy who, earlier this offseason, people were looking at as a glorified role player. Some people think he's not the star that people thought he could have been, even though he did have some good games last year. Darius Garland, another guy they drafted last year, had an up and down season, but for the most part, got a young guy who's improving. Larry Nance, Thonmaker, and they got some guys, but it's still not a very talented team. It's still not a team that you look at and say, "Wow, the Cleveland Cavaliers are they're ready to make that next step." And like I said, they really weren't active this offseason. So it makes me kind of wonder what their plan is moving forward. What is Cleveland's plan moving forward? You didn't really make any changes. I know you have young players that you're hoping develops. I think that's what they're maybe looking at. I think they're looking at J.B. Bickerstaff and saying, we're hoping that the young guys get better. We're hoping the young guys improve. they take the next step. We still got Kevin Love, an established veteran. Andre Drummond. Our front court, we feel like isn't that bad. If our back court develops, we still feel like in this conference we could compete and win some games. They brought back Matthew Dellavedova this offseason. So, and honestly, I forgot about him before that signing. I was like, dang, he's still in the league? Or he's still in Cleveland? But, Cleveland overall, it's just, there's a lot there that if you're a Cleveland fan, you're kind of going ahead expecting another bad year. I think everybody's expecting Cleveland not to be that great. I'm expecting Cleveland not to be that great this year. Like I said, they really didn't make any changes, and there's nothing about the team that you think is going to really take off. Now, we do have to admit that Cleveland did play better when they did go ahead and promote JB to the head coaching spot. And so, that's always something that you look at as a front office. Like, okay, the players are responding better to him. Really, last year we know with Boeheim, the players and him did not get along. They did not buy into what he was doing. They did not buy into what he was saying. There was a lot of disagreement. There was just not a lot of the on the same page talk between the guys and him. That's why he left. And so, as a team, you feel like, okay, well, if they buy into what JB is putting down, maybe we can have some success. Again, I'm sure they're not looking at this as a playoff year. They're just looking to see their young players grow and become good in their second years and hope for the best moving forward. And then the next team we want to get into, the Atlanta Hawks. If you've been listening to this podcast, that's one of my favorite team. That's my favorite team. I live in Atlanta, and I've been through it all with Atlanta. Obviously, being an Atlanta fan in general, but the Hawks. But the Hawks made a lot of moves this offseason. They made a lot of changes to the team. They made a lot of stuff happen. You already got Trae Young, 30-9. Some people still question if Trae Young could be a superstar for a team. But I think we've already established that he is a star. You got John Collins, probably their second best player in my opinion. 20-10, can shoot the three, mid-range, athletic, can block shots, dunk. Kevin Huerter, they call him Red Velvet, a marksman. You got Cam Reddish and DeAndre Hummer coming into the second year. They're having big expectations for Cam Reddish. And then this offseason, they added a lot of veterans. One thing they wanted to do, and the mission of the Hawks going into this offseason, is they wanted to win now. They wanted to be a team that would compete for a playoff spot in an improved Eastern Conference. So they added Danilo Gallinari, a great 3-and-D guy, could stretch the floor, a wing forward. They added Chris Dunn for defensive purposes, could also make a couple of plays. They added Rajon Rondo for veteran experience, can run the offense, can help mentor Trae, teach Trae some things, help him be a better player. They got Bogdanovic from the Sacramento Kings, one of the young 3-and-D guys that a lot of people sought after because he's also a marksman. They still have Clint Capella, who never played a game for him last year. Remember, when he was traded to Houston to Atlanta, he was hurt. So, we haven't seen him out there yet. They drafted the center from USC. His name has, escaped me at the moment, but they drafted him with the 6th overall pick. And he's in there now as a center and adds to the rotation. And now this team now looks like, wow, okay, they've made improvements. They're very deep. It feels like they're deep at every position. Someone's not getting minutes this year. We'll have to see who that is, but this team looks really good on paper, in terms of being good enough to potentially get a spot in the playoffs. And, I think the big thing we have to look at for me is Trae. Last year, my observation as a basketball person, not just looking at it as my favorite team, but as a basketball person watching the Hawks, one thing I quickly noticed was outside of John Wall and John Collins, they struggled to score. So when either one of them weren't in the game, offensively, it was a struggle for them because they didn't have enough established offensive players to be able to still be like, Trae could have a slightly, teams still need their star players to be their star players, but they could get support. one reason why I think the Hawks got off to that quick 3-0 start last year was Jabari Parker. Remember, Jabari Parker had a very good beginning of the season, first half of the season with the Atlanta Hawks. He was averaging like 18 a game. And what happened was he came off the bench. You got John giving you points, Trey giving you points, and Jabari was giving you points. So you lost John for about 25 games. And you saw Trey was in and out of the lineup. So it was always like you didn't have enough scoring. And then we know defensively they weren't that great. We know Trey's a liability defensively just because of his size. John Collins is not a great on-ball defender. You know, like I said, DeAndre Hunter really, in that starting lineup, was your best defender. Which, I mean, it's not a knock on DeAndre. And he's a guy who's expected to be a good perimeter defender during his career in the NBA. But he's a rookie. And so they really didn't have much defensive, and they didn't have much rim protection. And so what did they do? They said, we're going to get Clint Capel to help with rim protection. They drafted a guy from USA who's also good at rim protection. You know, you got Chris Dunn to help with perimeter defense. Ganari's a good defender. Not a great, but a good defender. You know, Rondo can play some defense. He's a very, you know, he can definitely help Trey on defense, being a smaller player, teach him how to play better defense to still be effective. You know, Bogdanovich isn't known for his defense, but he's a decent defender. Like, they've improved shooting. They've improved in terms of just offensive depth, where they have multiple guys who can score the ball, and they prove with post defense, and I think overall defense. And now the pressure is going to be on Lloyd Pierce this year. He has to formulate this and put this all together. He has to sit here and say, listen, they've given me talent. Some people were thinking he was potentially on the hot seat last year. He has to win with this team. If he doesn't, the Hawks seem like they will move on from him. But they want to give him a chance. That he was highly recommended, a guy who they feel like was great at developing. That's why they brought him in with the type of team they had, because they feel like he could develop the players. Now let's see what we do when we give you talent. You got to mix it together, figure out minutes. I'm sure he has to figure out all that, because obviously you know these situations. You want to help Herter, you know, Cam, you know, DeAndre still get better, develop, but you also know we're trying to win ball games, and I may need to go whoever is the best player at that time. And so the Hawks, to a lot of people, look like an up-and-coming team. What seed? We don't know. Some people are predicting 5 through 8, potentially. You know, because like I said, the Eastern Conference is a good. It's not an overly topped conference, but it's a good conference. But I believe the Hawks definitely have an opportunity to get into the playoffs. To me, they may not be in that top 4 with Brooklyn, Boston, Miami, and Milwaukee. They may be there with the Indianas, you know what I'm saying, or Toronto. Because, listen, Toronto, it was big for them losing Ibaka and losing Gasol. I think that was big losing them. So I don't even know where to put Toronto, but I think Toronto will still be a good team. And so really overall, the Hawks are going to be a very good, interesting team to watch this season. Like I said, not saying they're going to be a championship team by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're starting to put a foundation where they're like, we can start to win. We got Trey. Maybe we could entice another star to come to Atlanta and say, you could be with Trey what gets us to that next step. So it'll be very interesting and very exciting personally as a Hawks fan to see what this team looks like on paper in a couple of weeks and how they're going to look, putting all these pieces together. So we'll definitely have to stay tuned for that. But that's all the time we have for this segment. Coming up next, we'll continue my review of the Eastern Conference, getting into the next few teams at the bottom of the Eastern Conference. Stay tuned.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we just started our Eastern Conference breakdown of the off seasons for Eastern Conference teams. We're going to be getting the two last segment, the Hawks and the Cavs. We're going to continue this segment with more. But before we get into that, please, again, don't forget, as I remind once again, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball. That's GSMC_basketball. To talk about all things basketball happening in the association and also in college as well. We love to interact and get feedback from you, the listener, as without you guys, GSMC would not be GSMC. So continuing on with our review, we're going to get into the Detroit Pistons next. Detroit was a little busy this offseason with a lot of under-the-rating signings. They were able to nag a couple of guys, a few people. LiAngelo Ball, one of the Ball brothers. Obviously, I want to say congratulations to LeVar Ball. Now, all his sons are on NBA teams, on NBA contracts, because the LiAngelo really was the last one. LaMelo was drafted to Charlotte, and Lonzo's on the Pelicans. So, congratulations to that. They added Jeremy Grant. Big pickup for them. People thought Denver would try everything they could to get him. He had a big Western Conference Finals last year. A really, really good guy, really good player. He might break out in this offense you can logistically say he's a top 2 option now on this team. They got Wayne Ellington. Still got Blake Griffin, who's coming back from injury. Josh Jackson. He came over. He's now on Detroit. They also brought in Jahlil Okafor and Mason Plumlee. Still have Derrick Rose. They got young guys like Rodney Gruder. And a guy that they think could really break out is Sekou Dimiyaku. Okay, probably said his name and butchered it really wrong. But, the guy who dunked everybody last year. So they have some young guys on the team. And overall, Detroit, looks like a team this year with Dwayne Casey as head coach who could compete for maybe an 8th seed in the Eastern Conference playoffs. First biggest thing for them is Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin has to stay healthy. He was not healthy at all last year. So if he can stay healthy, that's a start. That is a start. Because, realistically, on this team, you look at this roster and think Blake Griffin's the best player. And he's played well. He actually had a career year about a couple of years ago in Detroit. He's played very well when he's been healthy. You got Derrick Rose, who's had his career resurgence. He's played very well for them. You added all the guys that I just listed. Obviously, Jeremy Grant's going to be a big addition. You look at it, hey, this team could, Dwayne Casey, his teams. They play great defense, and they try to play smooth, efficient basketball. And so Detroit definitely has the potential to be an 8th seed this year, like I said. A team that, like I said, isn't going to shock the world of basketball or anything of that sort. But they're to me a team that's going to be scrappy. They're going to compete, and it's like I said, if they stay healthy, they may be able to steal a couple wins from some of the top guys. So definitely, to me, I think Detroit is a team that has made some improvement. They're at that point where they're kind of hitting. They're at mediocrity, where they're just kind of they're good enough to potentially make the playoffs, but not really to do anything else. And they're not really going into a rebuilding mode either, so they're kind of just there. This is they always call this basketball infamy, because they always feel like this is the worst spot you want to be as a franchise, because as a fan, your team could beat some teams, they could maybe make the playoffs, but you really don't have any expectations past that. So it's kind of just like, okay, it's not like, oh, we're going to be the worst team. They could be the worst team if injuries happen, but you're not going to be the best team regardless if you stayed healthy. So definitely that's where Detroit is right now. I think Detroit overall, though, if they could just get a guy to or maybe make a big trade. I know they've been looking to potentially move Blake Griffin. Derrick Rose will probably still be in trade talks. This may be, depending on how the season goes for them, you never know. With the trade deadline in March, if they're sitting there with 8 games under 500, they may say, okay, let's trade Blake, let's trade Derrick, let's blow this thing up and see what happens. So that's something we got to keep a lookout for with Detroit this season when they're trying to decide what the direction of this team is going into the next few years are going to be. And now we're going to get into those Knicks, the New York Knicks, with the Mecca of basketball, Madison Square Garden, the Knicks, baby. We're going to talk about the Knicks. Started the offseason by hiring a new head coach, Tom Thibodeau. Very respected coach around the NBA, a guy who really, some people have questioned he burns his players out, but gets the most out of his guys. They have a young team. They still have RJ Barrett in his second year looking to make the next step. He played very well in his first year. He wasn't bad. He wasn't special, but he wasn't bad. He was solid, and there's nothing wrong with that. They still have Reggie Bullock, Alec Burks, Michael Kidd, Gilchrist, Kevin Knox. He's kind of been a disappointment after that promising rookie year. He's kind of been a disappointment for the Knicks. Hopefully, with Tom, maybe he can get back on track. They've added Nerlens Noel. They still have Frank, Alfred Payton, Miles Powell, Julius Randle, big free agent signing. They added Austin Rivers as well. Mike Mitchell Robinson, a guy who looks like he could be one of the up-and-coming centers in this league. Dennis Smith Jr. is still on there. A guy that I still feel like is underrated. Remember, he was in the Rookie of the Year conversation his first year, and then they drafted Luka, and now all of a sudden we act like Dennis Smith can't play. Like, listen, he's not Luka, we get that. But he's not, you don't have the rookie year he had, and then you're not good. If he's never going to be a star for you, fine, but he's a good point guard. To me, if anything, he's going to have an Eric Bledsoe-like career, and it's not bad. That's not a knock. Because Eric Bledsoe, you see he got paid. He's a starting point guard everywhere he goes. And that may be Dennis Smith Jr. And they also drafted Obi Toppin and Emmanuel Quickley. So, the Knicks, we know the Knicks for such a long time have been the laughingstock of the NBA. Because of the fact that they are supposed to be the big brand. Everybody wants to play there, and they've just been so mediocre. And they haven't made the playoffs since Carmelo back in the early 2010s. And, it's just, there's a lot of question. There's a lot of, what is this Knicks team going to be? They have some talent. Now, this team does have some talent. And I think, again, I expect them to be competitive. I expect them to compete for a playoff spot. I do. I don't think this is going to be a tanking year for them. I know a lot of people feel like they should have gotten a point guard. And listen, all I'm saying is, this is just me. I'm a fan of Dennis Smith Jr. Yes, there were some issues last year in New York, but listen, I think they should give him a chance. You still got Alfred Payton. You got Frank, even though they're basically the same player, which are defensive first players. But you got Dennis who give you some points. Maybe Emmanuel Quickley can provide some spark. Maybe you never know. We sleep on rookies in the NBA because we think if they're not a high pick, what are they really going to contribute? But he might be able to contribute a little bit. And I expect Obi Toppin to be a big part of what they do. Because their front court is if you look at the Knicks front court, they have a very good front court. You have Julius Randle, who is a good player. Obi Toppin, they think, has star potential written on him. Mitchell Robinson is a very good center. Front court wise, that's where they're going to win their games. That's when they're going to get their most success. The key for them is their backcourt. Can they get enough from guys like Austin Rivers, Emmanuel Quickley, Dennis Smith Jr., Alfred Payton? Can they get enough from guys like that? Alec Burks. That's going to be the key for them. Listen, I know as a Knicks fan, you want them to compete for championships right away, or you want them to land a big free agent right away. But I still look at this team and think there's talent on this team. Again, they're not a team that's going to shock the world, but I think the Knicks can play some good basketball. I think, honestly, they're maybe one of the teams that might have the advantage at the beginning of the season because they haven't played in so long. They have a lot of young guys on the team, and they're going to be hungry to try to win. And Tom is going to get the most out of them that he can. He's going to push them. He's going to do everything he can to get them in the right position to be successful. So I definitely think the Knicks are a team that we shouldn't sleep on, and a team that overall I think going into this next season, again, Could they make the playoffs? Of course. It's the Knicks. That would be the typical Knicks thing to do. But it's not like this is a team that's void of talent and they just have people. They have some guys they really like. There's some guys I look at this team and say, okay, I want to see what he can do. And we're going to have to see how it looks and how they look going forward. Because I think they can be very competitive. And I think as a team, there's nothing wrong with just being competitive, man. It really isn't. So we're going to have to see how it goes. And then we're going to get into our last team before we got here for this segment. The Chicago Bulls hiring Billy Donovan this offseason from the Oklahoma City Thunder to be the new head guy. You know, as the guy. You basically have, you know, Wendell Carter Jr., a young guy who they think, again, Chicago has a lot of young potential star talent, and they're looking to develop it and get to that kick. Like I said, Wendell Carter is one. We know about, you know, Zach LaVine. You know, he was 25 points a game last year. He's the best offensive player they have right now. Lauri Markkanen, a guy who had a really good rookie season last year, had some injuries, didn't play as well, but still a guy who has potential. Otto Porter, a good 3-and-D guy. Storanci, he could be the next guy on that 3-and-D list if he continues his success from last year, who could maybe break out. Denzel Valentine, you know, Noah Vonleh, Kobe White. We know he had big games down the stretch before COVID stopped. He had a couple 30-point games off the bench. A guy who obviously can show he could score. Thaddeus Young. This team has some talent. And it's just on Billy Donovan to really bring this together, because they're looking at what he did with Oklahoma City. You don't have that star veteran player like they had in Chris Paul, but he looked at a lot of young guys, a lot of pieces thrown together, and he got the most out of it to the playoffs. And also a guy who seems to connect with players. That's one thing that Jim Boylan did not do. He did not connect with these players. The players did not like this man. They did not like this man as a coach. And obviously, if your players are like, we need to get him out of here, that's a big deal. And so they look at Billy Donovan, they think he's the right guy for this team. The Bulls, based off talent, to me, should make the playoffs. They are a team that, to me, should make the playoffs. Now, there are questions, would they move Zach LaVine? That's something that you potentially will have to keep an eye on. Maybe they would move off Zach LaVine. You know, like I said, they have a lot of young talent. Maybe they can kind of get maybe a key veteran player in there. Like I said, I think they're maybe hoping Kobe White takes the next step. Maybe he becomes a starter for them this year. You know, Wendell Carter, again, he's expected to do it. Lauri Markkanen, they're looking for him to get more back to what he was before as that stretch four. And like I said, they have a lot of talent on this team to really be a good team. They just need more consistency, which is obviously the issue with most young teams is consistency. And they just need to be able to really learn how to win games. The Bulls had to lead a lot of games last year and lost a lot of them. And that's usually typical of young teams. And so Billy Donovan's tasked with that. He's put a really good staff together. And I think the Bulls are a team that you have to look at and say, hey, potential playoff team. And honestly, out of all the teams, you may sit here and say, you know, hey, they're talented. They're a team that can take some wins away from some good teams and sneak their way into the playoffs. And they, like I said, they're not a championship team by any sort of the imagination, but they're a very team that they're going to scratch and claw. They have a lot of young, good players, and it'll be fun to watch this team. They'll probably be one of the funner teams also to watch this year if they develop and they look the way they want to look moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Chicago Bulls moving on into the future and seeing what they look like. They're a team definitely I'm going to be keeping an eye on this year as well to see the development of their players. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into some NBA news and some college basketball news. So stay tuned right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. to the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we got into some more Eastern Conference offseason reviews, talking about some of the teams in the Eastern Conference. We got through 5 today, so definitely got to pick it up. Probably most of the show, next show, will probably be the rest of the Eastern Conference. So I guess that's exciting right there. But, you know, now I'm about to get into something I don't really talk about a lot, or I haven't talked about, honestly, ever since it stopped. And that's college basketball. Yes, college basketball. You know, we cover that here on the podcast. I know a lot of people may have started listening to it while I was just covering strictly NBA, because college basketball was not at all being played during COVID. And so, yes, we do cover college basketball on the podcast. And, you know, I always try to dedicate at least a segment to it, because college basketball, really, till March Madness, is not the easiest thing to talk about, just because of the fact that there's so much going on. It's just like you just talk about the major teams, the major upsets, as just major news, and that's what you really talk about. You don't talk about every other conference that exists. So you just have to figure out what do you consider to be important to be talked about. And me, I usually try to stick more to the AP polls. You know, I keep an eye on how teams are doing, try to give a quick review on how things are going. Haven't watched too much college basketball this year, but I have kept up, obviously, with who's struggling, who's doing well this year. So, definitely going to try to get more into it, trying to watch more of it, because, that's part of what I do, how I'm supposed to tell you guys, who I think might be someone who could be dangerous in this year's NCAA tournament. So, that's what we're going to talk about this segment. So, I'm going to go ahead and get into the top 10 teams in the AP 25 poll currently. And we're going to start with 10, which is currently the Houston Cougs. The Houston Cougs, baby. They're 4-0 in the season. Houston's had some very impressive wins. I think they've really done well this year. They basically, the college basketball is just such a large landscape, because, you got teams that are from conferences you never heard of. They're in the top 10. And, Houston's heard of because, they're in a major sports, territory and everything in Texas. But, they're having a good season so far. And Creighton is number 9 at 3-0. Creighton's always they always produce good basketball teams every year. Creighton is always one of those mid-major schools that just always produces one of the better basketball teams. Never someone who maybe wins it all, but someone who definitely can make a run. And, obviously it eats it hard out every time. And they're starting the season off 3-0 is great. Michigan State has played the most games on any team in this top 10. They're 5-0. Last year was kind of a down year for Michigan State. Michigan State really wasn't the same Michigan State of old last year. Obviously, there were some issues and everything like that. But, they came out, they bounced back. They're 5-0. They're basketball power. It was funny because early in the decade, in 2010s, Michigan State and Michigan State football were both really good. And, I know in the North, basketball was considered more popular and considered the bigger sport from what I've been told from people who have lived in the North that I know. So I'm assuming Michigan State was more of a basketball school, which kind of makes sense now to this day because of the fact that they're still very successful in basketball while their football team has kind of diminished. Kansas, obviously, clearly a basketball school, 4-1 this year. I believe their only loss was to Gonzaga this year, but it was a close game. Kansas, also last year really wasn't the best year for them. But they're bouncing back, starting off 4-1. That's important. Getting themselves back where they need to be. Jay Self and all of them, they're going to get those guys right. And, Kansas, I would say, is probably my favorite college basketball team. So, always good to see the Jayhawks doing well, especially during this COVID season where a lot of teams have had to postpone games and cancel games. You're going to see a lot of it. So it'll be interesting to see how all these records kind of work out. I mean, I'm not even talking about everybody else, but literally there's only one team in the top 25 that hasn't even played a game yet, and that's Tennessee, and they haven't even played a game in their 13th. So, that means there's high expectations for Tennessee this year. At number 6, the Blue Devils, the Dukes. They They've only played 3 games this year. They're 2-1, but, Duke's always a top basketball team in college basketball every year. Mike Krzyzewski is always going to have those guys, usually getting 1 or 2 of the best recruits in the country. They're going to be there. They're going to compete. They're going to be one of the best, and that's all you can really do with it. Number 5, Illinois. A lot of people didn't know what to think of Illinois this year. It seems like people in the AP looked at them very highly, and they've moved up. College basketball is one of those things you can move up very rapidly. If you're unranked and being beat 2 top 10 teams, you could easily be a top 10 team. And Illinois is really taking advantage of some of the wins they've had. They have a loss, but they've had to take advantage of the wins they had, and they've been looked at as a team to really look out for when it gets to March, because you don't really hear about Illinois basketball a lot, but Illinois basketball team really looks good this year. Wisconsin, usually a typical power in college basketball. We don't look at Wisconsin as a power in college basketball, but they always produce solid teams year after year. They're 4th right now in the polls. At number 3, Iowa's 3-0. Garza, hey, I saw that 30-point game he had the other day. That man could score. He could score the basketball. Iowa is going to be a tough out. He kind of reminds me of Purdue a couple years ago with I believe, I can't remember. He plays on Boston right now. I think his first name's Cameron, or his last name's Cameron. I can't remember his name right now, but he kind of reminds me of him, just an electric scorer. And he's going to be the reason why Iowa's going to be a tough out. Then you got Baylor, clearly the number 2 team in the country. Baylor, they've really established. They have a lot of experience. So they had a lot of guys come back from last year's team. One thing about this college basketball year that I think is going to be really impressive to look at is that, remember, with COVID happening, a lot of players didn't go out last year. A lot of players who would have maybe gone and left school during a normal year didn't because of COVID. And so a lot of these teams, and Baylor's one of those recipients, have kept a lot of their team last year, which was really good. I think Baylor was a top 5 team last year, if I remember correctly. And so now they're bringing back a lot of guys. Obviously, bringing the new recruits and some transfers. And now, Baylor is a very good team. And Gonzaga clearly, too. Because Gonzaga, they're not really known as a power. I mean, literally, they just got one of their first. They got a 5-star. There's not a lot of 5-stars. As long as Gonzaga's been good, there haven't been a lot of 5-star recruits that have gone to Gonzaga. And they got one. And now he's the centerpiece of the team. And with a lot of the guys that usually stays, because remember, Gonzaga's not that NBA program where you hear a bunch of NBA players come out of Gonzaga. So a lot of their players stick around. And that's what I think helps Gonzaga be so competitive, because they always seem to have the best continuity out of any college basketball team because of that. And this year, that's why they're the number 1 team. They've gone against tough competition to start, and they've won. So definitely an impressive team among all of that. Even though they did just pause activities due to COVID-19. As like I said, this will probably happen a few times throughout the year. College programs are going to stop, postpone some games because of that. But I do want to talk about one team that's usually a basketball power real quick, but has struggled. And that's the Kentucky Wildcats. So Kentucky has fallen to 1-3 this season. They just lost to Georgia Tech, who hasn't beaten them since 2000. That was the last time Georgia Tech beat Kentucky. And so Kentucky right now is just not looking very Kentucky. They're not. They're struggling. And it just isn't what you usually expect out of a John Calipari coach team. If you look at their schedule, they lost to Richmond, which a lot of people were shocked by. They were 10th at the time. But, Richmond's a very experienced team. They've been around each other for a while. Usually, like I said, guys like Richmond, they're a very well-experienced team. Second half, Kentucky just really struggled. And then, they lost to Kansas. I mean, that's a top matchup. So you're like, okay, 2 top teams. It was a 3-point game. Like, okay, it happens. But the Yellow Jackets game was just shocking because, yes, Georgia Tech actually currently, is 1-2. Well, now is 1-2 with this win. And they lost their first 2 games. And then you're coming into this game if you're Kentucky. This is a game that you would think Kentucky would flex their muscles and really dominate, and then they lose. And the way they did, and it's just kind of like, well, shoot. Is Kentucky really not as good as they think? And We'll just have to see. I mean, usually Kentucky basketball fans put a lot into the stock of the season for Kentucky because that's their major sports team that usually does well every year. And so this is definitely disappointing to start off 1-3 in the season. Now probably about to be unranked. Definitely, hopefully they can turn it around. But, that's pretty much everything that's happening in college basketball so far. So, there you go. So I'm definitely going to try to keep this part of the show moving forward. But before we get out of here, I want to get back into the NBA, talk about a topic. So, obviously, last show we talked about Paul George and the comments he made on All the Smoke podcast with Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson about, what happened in that series against Denver and how he basically kind of deflected the blame and said it was Doc Rivers. They didn't know how to use us. They didn't know how to make adjustments. He didn't know how to use me. Well, Doc responded, and basically he just said, he took the high break, but also made a good point. He said, basically, everybody has to take responsibility. And literally that's what everybody's been saying about Paul George since those comments, is that he's taking no responsibility for his part. Because Paul George played like just not good. He did not play well. And to me, Paul George is under the most pressure out of any player in the league to me this year. Because I know he views himself as a star player, like, I wasn't put in a position to be great. Even Matt Barnes said on The Jump, I believe, he thinks that from the interview, Paul George is still in his own head. Paul George listen, it's not the regular season that we're going to look at, because we know Paul George can play well in the regular. We know Paul George can make plays in the regular season. When the playoffs come back around, Paul George is going to have to play better. He's going to have to do better. Because if he doesn't, there's going to be big issues. There's going to be issues. I think Clippers might let him walk. And even though he is a great player, I don't know if any teams that maybe are championship teams would go out of their way to sign him. Or maybe a team that maybe needs a third star may say, okay, Paul George can't even be the second option. Maybe he could be the third option on our team. Because if he continues to play like that in the playoffs, he's not... Paul George really, like I said, if things don't end well for the Clippers this year, especially for Paul George, will probably be one of the worst 2-year stints of his career based off what happened in the playoffs, based off the comments he's making now, not taking any responsibility. And then if he doesn't show up again, it's just, dude, what happened, bro? What happened? So definitely have to keep an eye on Paul George this season to see how he does, through all the criticism, because social media will criticize him every time he has a bad game. But that's all the time we have here for the podcast. Thank you for tuning in once again to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Don't forget to listen to our other amazing podcasts here on the GSMC Podcast Network. Also, don't forget, again, to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball. And then also don't forget to leave a comment, review, subscribe, whatever platform you're listening to us on for the GSMC Podcast Network. We definitely appreciate it. This is your host, Brice, saying have a good day and signing out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.